You read pages 1 to 26. I use as often as I can. And I understand your complaints or your worries about lectures. That is, if all lecturers were laid end to end, they probably should be kept that way. And that's how I feel also, and it would be fun to discuss it step by step. But I'm eager to have your response, your questions based on your reading or my presentation today. And hopefully, as the course proceeds, you'll become familiar with the 4 steps in this guided decision-making process, feel at home with it, and be able to take away from the course material, principles, suggested steps in a process that you can apply elsewhere. The Potter Box was designed by Ralph Potter, a social ethicist at Harvard Divinity School. In 1972, he was working on the question of nuclear technology. And if we want public debate over nuclear war or military technologies of different kinds, what are the basic ingredients in a public debate that we need to get it beyond minimalistic ethics, to reach a justified conclusion, to be able to handle a complicated question like that in a sophisticated manner? And as he was dealing with the question in social ethics of nuclear policy, he insisted that at least 4 steps be taken, resolved satisfactorily, before we make a judgment. And that is now called the Potter Box in professional ethics. We're applying it in this course to communications, but it can be used in business and law as well. And it's important to me because it deals with social ethics. He's not only interested in each of us making a decision ourselves. We have to at some point if we're involved and responsible. But he wants it done on the social level so that we deal with institutional questions with broader perspectives that we take into account, another way of putting it, not only philosophy, but sociology. This is social ethics, not just individualistic decision-making. And what often happens in our dealing with ethical questions is the obvious. That is, we reach deep into our own conscience, we think about prejudices or moral values that we have, and we make a decision. Oftentimes our conclusions are not very sophisticated, or we can't defend them outside of my impression is, or not sure what the terminology would be, but whatchamacallit is, or my presumption is such and such. In order to get beyond a minimalistic ethics, to leave us with debate at the end, or with a lot of quandaries about what the best solution actually is, the Potter Box attempts to teach us systematically to work from one step to another, to see their integration, to be able to answer at least 4 basic questions, and then make a decision. We've just been working with Cecil Labat. She says every step in your decision-making, if you confront the question of deception, has to go through 3 steps. And you'll recognize in Potter a similarity to that. Actually, she is working out of the same system that Potter is, at least as step 1, 3, and 4 are parallel to her steps 1, 2, and 3 in chapter 7. It's based on the old saw, that if you teach someone how to fish, you've secured a lifetime. If you fish for them, you only secure the day. Therefore, the assumption is, through this model of moral reasoning, taking seriously these 4 steps, seeing their relationship and their integration, we'll have a way of reaching justified conclusions. We'll become mini ethicists on our own. As you know, the 2 major goals of the course are to stimulate the moral imagination, to recognize moral dilemmas as they occur, to be more specific about the moral issue involved in this particular case. The second goal is to develop analytical reasoning, to do ethics, not just impressions or ideas or my assumptions, but significant thinking about ethics, to develop an analytical procedure that enables us to do ethics well. You've seen this model from chapter 1, the introduction in the book. Let me explain how the 4 different steps are put together in Potter's mind. Much of this developed, or at least introduced briefly, in the book itself. You'll notice the top 2, that is empirical definition and choosing loyalties. Both of those are sociological. On that level, on the external, on the obvious, you must deal, Potter says, with real-life situations, with actual cases as they appear, with situations that you confront if you're in advertising, public relations, or writing script for film, or in journalism. The top tier, empirical definition and choosing loyalties, are sociological, are immediate, are external, whereas the bottom 2 are internal. They are reflection on what's happening. They are philosophical in character rather than sociological. The top tier being sociological and the bottom philosophical. And that's what Potter wants to see. And you've noticed that already in Bach's book. The sociological analysis of how lying may destroy society, but also the theoretical or philosophical reflection. Both of them. This is applied ethics, working back and forth between sociology or real life and philosophy, reflection about it. So if you think in terms of the tiers this way, one must justify conclusion both tiers levels seriously. You must be good about defining the situation, knowing what happened, what's really involved here. Step number 1, crucial, defining the issues. Getting clear on what's at stake and what's involved, what's actually happening. And to be dogged empirically. The way the book is organized, the first half of each belongs to that first tier. Describes the situation, what are the factors involved, what happened, what were the conclusions, what deadlines were being met, who made the decision, etc. But Bach is arguing also that you come in step 3 of her process to getting it back into the public arena. What would reasonable people say? You made a decision as a professional, but now, in effect, present that in the light of day. And Mr. Potter suggests the same thing. Come back in step number 4, that is choosing your loyalties, to deal with real cases and real people, the implications of your decision come back into public life. So it's because of that upper tier that we call it social ethics. Ethics done in a social context. You'll notice on the left-hand side, that is empirical definition and identifying values. It's on that side of the Potter box that we're dealing with what is. This is descriptive. This is analysis. We must get inside the steps of the case, the situation as they develop, but also consult our values. What choices were made for what reason? If you ask an editor, a public relations executive, or a film writer, what values were important to you as you wrote this? Or as you read some of the commentary, the second half of each of our cases, you'll usually get a rationale. What we value, what we consider important. The left-hand side is a description. People said, I made this choice or this decision because the public has a right to know. And I happen to value the public's right to know. Or I value the First Amendment's no prior restraint. Or I value truth-telling if I'm advertising. Or I value immediacy. The story has to move forward first. Values, as they're described in box number 2, are part of the is descriptive analysis of what's occurring. You'll notice on the right-hand side, appeal to ethical principles, box 3 and 4, quadrant 3 and 4, that Potter is teaching us to think about what ought to be. If the left-hand side is what is, the right-hand side is the ought, or the imperative. This is the normative, whereas the left side is the descriptive. Maybe those are the best terms to use. The left side, the is, or descriptive, and the right side, these two, normative, the normative, or the critical. We're dealing with the sociological and the philosophical, if you're thinking horizontally, and with the descriptive and the analytical, if you're thinking in terms of the left hand and the right hand columns. And you notice there are several lines going between these quadrants. Potter is suggesting that you can begin at any stage of the process. Ordinarily in the course we'll start with quadrant 1. What's the situation? What is the case? What's the problem here? But you could begin on some other level with some of the theory as well, as Bach in effect does with chapters 3 and 4. What are the theoretical issues, perspectives on a question such as deception? They are linked and integrated with one another. What Potter is concerned about is that if you take only steps 1 and 2, the analytical side, you short-circuit the process. And often that's like, you're facing a question if you're in news. You consult professional values in your own spirit, in your conscience, deep inside your being. And you're saying one of the professional values here is immediacy. We must get this news out as soon as we can. That was certainly Michael Miller's thinking in that case as we discussed it. And you make a decision. You go with it. Oftentimes we take steps 1 and 2, Potter would say, and end up drawing a conclusion. We make a judgment and ignore theory, step 3, or choosing loyalty, step 4. That certainly was true of the Pentagon Papers case, which is number 12 in the book. The New York Times and the Washington Post are given material about our involvement in the Vietnam War. They realize the public has a right to know. As a press, they ought not to sit on important material, and nobody has prior restraint, such as the Attorney General, so they make a decision and publish. What we're concerned about in the course is that we take steps 1 and 2, quadrants 1 and 2, with utmost seriousness and spend a great deal of time getting our heads straight on step 1 and 2, but not stop there, to make sure that we think theoretically about it, and then also go to quadrant 4 and ask what the implications are if we make a decision that we've temporarily concluded in step number 3 we ought to make. It happens in what's called analytical philosophy that you take step 3. That is, we must ensure that we do theoretical thinking, bring principles into account, the history of ideas, and meta-ethics. But we stop there. And Potter is suggesting, and that's what this course is arguing also, step 3 is fundamentally important to the decision-making process, but in itself is not enough. We finally must decide who will be loyal to. In the case of absence of malice, if you remember that, and Megan, the case at this point in the episode, that she had to decide whether her loyalties to Teresa, privacy, to her pleas that she not carry this information forward into the newspaper, either loyalty to her or to Megan's own career, or loyalty to journalism and the public's right to know. It's some abstract principle. And often that's where the crunch comes, as a matter of fact, in step number 4. 4 steps that are integrated, that take principles and practice seriously, that put together in a systematic form sociology or a sociological perspective on the upper tier and a philosophical one as well. Professional ethics, or applied ethics as it's often called, a model of guided decision-making and of moral reasoning that help us to take step number 5. I've been talking of 4 when actually the step number 5. You can use this model to either draw a particular conclusion, make a judgment about the episode that you are facing. It can help Megan deal with the question of Teresa. Am I going to publish this story of her abortion or not? That's a particular judgment. But it can also be used to set a policy. You can use it in the newsroom or in public relations firm, or if you're writing scripts or doing technology in a music firm. That is, to make it about policy, how to use anonymous sources, what to do in the case of suicide. What is our policy if we're an advertising firm regarding advertising? If we're in entertainment television, what is our policy about sexist language? What are we going to do to eliminate it? It enables us to make justified conclusions about particular cases, but also policy. Once we've gone through the 4 steps, then it's important to make a decision, either in terms of that particular policy that we may use for the organization and firm of which we're a part. And then you'll notice the feedback loop. In a sense, you could say there are really 6 steps in the process. That is, once you've drawn a conclusion about the case or established a policy for your firm or organization, the idea of the feedback loop is to take it through the Potter box once again. Often we do that mentally as we're playing with it anyhow. We try a few different options, see which one is the most defensible, the most sophisticated, most complicated way of dealing with the question, gives us the best critical power in dealing with the issue, and move back and forth among several different possibilities as we go along. But the feedback loop says if you're still dissatisfied, or if you draw a conclusion and somebody draws the opposite, maybe it's good to go back over the Potter box once again. The point behind the Potter box is to identify disagreements, to see where the issues are important, the location of the fundamental debates that we still may have. The assumption in the Potter box is not that you're moral and somebody else is immoral, or that you're theoretically sophisticated and somebody else is not. That may be true. The disagreement could be in box number 3, and you've chosen one ethical system and another person hasn't, or a different one. But oftentimes a disagreement is in step number 1. And it's too simple to use the example of debate over abortion. It's not a question there of step number 3. That is, some people are immoral. They wish to take life, or downgrade life, or abuse life, and I'm righteous about life. It's really over a moral principle and my righteousness and unrighteousness. That's the way it's often characterized. Now, Potter would say, what about step number 1? What are you actually assuming here? Maybe the disagreement is over the facts of the matter. That is, some of you assuming that life begins at conception, and another group assuming that life begins when it's viable outside the mother. And as long as there's disagreement about that biological fact, which you can't resolve, it's a disagreement over facts, not over moral position. Potter wants to ensure that we keep asking ourselves, where is the debate? And oftentimes we can agree to disagree. In the case of abortion, and again I'm being too simplistic here, it's a very complicated public issue, but it's one that centers from Potter's framework on the first box. And as long as there's no biological agreement about it, we ought to learn to be more tolerant in terms of our disagreement. Unless there's some evidence of it so that we both begin from the same starting point, the disagreements will continue. And when that happens, the recommendation obviously is tolerance, openness to other people's opinions. There will be disagreement at the end of the Potter box. We locate the Potter box. In the Potter box, we locate that disagreement more specifically. It's intended to clarify our thinking. And what we'll find is that surprisingly we agree on many of the same conclusions. We might be using two different principles and still draw the same conclusion because both of those principles argue, in this case, for the same thing. And it'll take some sophistication to know which principles actually are the most powerful to use, but that should take care of itself as we go along. So it doesn't promise to eliminate all disagreement. What it promises to do is to eliminate minimalistic ethics, or whatchamacallit ethics, or quandary ethics, in which we use our impressions but we remain confused or uncertain. And if there are valid disagreements, in some cases we respect the right of other people to disagree because both of us have taken seriously the justification process. We've both tried to think it through in a reasonable and systematic form. Love to stop at this point and entertain your questions. Let me just add a few more comments about a couple of the steps in the process, and then we'll close this down and welcome your debate and your questions after I'm finished. One of the issues is box number 2. That is the values quadrant. What are included there? And why are they important? The word values, as most of you may know, comes from the Latin valere, meaning to give worth to something. The word worth, to appraise and then assign worth. To do an analysis, like evaluate, and decide, as we appraise it, that this thing or process or person has value. To rate things on a scale and give it a value of 10, or a positive value or a negative value. Our values are our presuppositions about social life and human nature. To value means that we consider it desirable. And as we argue in the introductory chapter, rather than assuming the old Enlightenment split between facts and values, that what we're about in the academic world is getting all the facts straight and values come on later. The assumption actually is that values pervade everything we do, that a scientist is value-driven as much as a professional journalist or a script writer would be value-driven. That is part and parcel of life. This is a value-centered approach to communication, that we all operate more or less out of particular commitments that we have, that life has presuppositions, that you can't think without certain presuppositions or values. So the importance in Potter is to be explicit about that. What values are at stake? No life is neutral. You cannot draw a conclusion by ignoring values, and to the extent that we keep them under the surface or don't bring them into its own, don't bring our biases into our own reflection, to that degree, our answers, our conclusions, our step number 5 will not be as sophisticated as it could be. Creation is part of that process. Let's clarify what our values are, critical analysis through theory as to what values we ought to support. I put here on the screen a list of some values that occurred to me under different categories. We have certain professional values that are at stake, or moral values, aesthetic values, logical values, social-cultural values. These are a list of values that we deem desirable, and they work their way through these cases and commentaries all the time. The professional values that I criticized when we were dealing with the Michael Miller case are listed as the last two on the process. Some values are negative. Some ought to be criticized and eliminated, and others are positive. But you notice at the bottom of the list, the vigilante complex, the Lone Ranger complex. Justice is up to me. When I, as reporter, take hold of it, then the issues are finally straight and clarified in people's minds. I can't depend on the system. It's me who is the lawgiver, the judge, and the jury, and the police officer in this case. And the smoking out process, used in the absence of malice case and Michael Miller, is another professional value. That is, let's attempt by this trial balloon to see what happens. Maybe that will move the case forward. Some of the values here, like novelty or thoroughness, are positive values. And when it comes to the news or to public relations, advertising, or entertainment, sometimes novelty or entertainment dominates. We need an approach that's creative, that's fresh, or something that has entertainment value, as you see so often now in the Budweiser commercials. Entertainment, they're fun to watch. These are values that are not negative. In most instances, they're positive. Some on the list, however, need to be called into judgment. There are moral values, too, that are often very similar to the ethical theories that we introduce in the third quadrant. And if we're appealing finally to moral values like honesty, I just have to be honest in this case, that's probably a value that when you get to step number 3 will be endorsed by the ethical theories that we introduce there. Aesthetic values are important, obviously, in entertainment, in writing scripts for television, often in public relations, and they're useful also in the professional world of news. What we'll be doing in the course is asking ourselves what values are at stake here. When the editor said, I decided X, what reason did that editor give? Values, rather than be sublimated or held at abeyance, are brought into the front. And we read several reflections of that these days in professional behavior. Indicate your bias right up front. Your political bias, your religious bias. Make that transparent rather than assume that you're neutral. Put it out there for the other people to see. Make it obvious, and that's what we're attempting to do in the Potter box as well. Values, what we consider worthwhile, what we believe to be desirable, often being the final appeal. Whereas in the Potter box, what we want to do is to make it an important step of the process, but not the last resort. Not what we appeal to deep inside, something that we know intuitively, values embed in our own conscience, and then make a decision to go with the story and short circuit steps 3 and 4. Several kinds of values, the ones that you see there on the board, are illustrative. And again, as we go along, what we attempt to do in the textbook is to indicate what values are apparent in this situation, or what values are at stake. What often happens as we work through the Potter box, when we appeal to professional values such as the independence of the newspaper, our independence we value highly, so that we're not told by the government or by law and order officials, by the police, what to do. It's our independence as a value which is critical, and we celebrate that. But as we go along, we notice already in the work of Cicely Bach, and it'll become more apparent as we proceed, that simply to depend on values is a frail reed. Often they're helpful. They move us forward. That's the way we are as human beings, we as valuing creatures. But values also are not dependable in every case, as Cicely Bach instructed us. When we value certain components of our own being, they're deep inside our being, moral values, logical values, social cultural values, we often rationalize. It's tricky to use values, she says, that are deep inside of us. They may lead us finally to the right conclusion, but because they're part of our own person and being and understanding of the world, we're often defensive about them. It's hard to think critically beyond them. And that's what we want to do in the right-hand section of the Potter box. To do critical thinking, to draw a conclusion that's justified, one that will hold its light of day against those who draw other conclusions, one that we can finally defend, not because we say, well, that's what I happen to believe inside, as part of the process, but not as a final appeal. But we argue our case because we've drawn a conclusion that has more steps in the process than just this one, number 2. So quadrant number 2 is important in terms of clarification, but not dependable to give us a final answer. For one reason, because we tend to rationalize or have our biases unexamined. Now, the second argument is maybe a little more complicated, but should become clear. Karen LaBox, in her book on professional morality, argues our relations of power. Professions are institutions of power. Those who are part of a cultural industry with a great deal of power. And if you say it's values which uncritically ought to determine how we make a conclusion, what you're doing is making your professional power or your personal stake in your conclusion. Box number 2 tends to be rationalized. Our values, it's the location of professional privilege. And I talked briefly about that in connection with the absence of malice case. If we depend only on box number 2, on certain professional values, the public has a right to know, or we must meet the deadline. That is, immediacy or firstness is important to this. What often happens, says Georgianne Geyer, since I mentioned her a couple days ago, is that our own career gets involved. We invoke that value because it serves us as a member of the press or an agent in an advertising firm. The power connected to the institutional values or professional values represented in step number 2 often blind our clear thinking. But we take values seriously. We'll come back to them in virtually every case. They're reiterated in the commentary section of each case in the book. They're important to identify and to make explicit so that we can move on fruitfully. And when I had the Potter box up here on the screen, let me put it back there just for your reference. Notice that under step 3, we've listed 5 different ethical theories. There are a host of them, but what we've chosen for the sake of our teaching in this course and in the book are 5 major theories that have dominated theoretical ethics in the West. And as we go along, we'll be suggesting several alternatives outside of the Western context. We're going over the various modes of making decisions or appealing to principles. They've concluded, many of them have at least, that there are 5 appeals that you can finally make: to virtue, duty, to results, to love, or to rights. As we organize our world theoretically or principially, it often appeals in the final instance to one of these 5 approaches. And we've taken the leading representatives, the most dominant in the literature, to each of these 5 approaches. And we'll explain more of that as we go along. On Wednesday we start with Aristotle, an appeal to virtue, the virtue of harmony, balance, and the golden mean. You'll have a chance to read some of Confucius, who made the same claims from a non-Western perspective. What we're attempting to do in the theoretical section is focus on these 5 theories. but with several spin-offs also to other possibilities that represent virtue or duty or consequences or love or rights. The 5 appeals that have dominated the theoretical ways of organizing the world of ethics. Often as we get to theory, some of our values are called into question. That is, your professional value of immediacy bumps up against this theory. You begin to do some critical thinking about steps number 1 and 2 once you get to step 3. Our theoretical work will concentrate on those 5 principles, and you'll be given ideas and supply best under which circumstances. All theories open up the world, but they close down pieces of it too. They're addressed to particular arguments or problems. No theory is the final answer under every circumstance. Aristotle works better in complicated situations for which both have particular claims or rights at stake. Issues of power. We use on role of inequality, a powerful news reporter on the one hand and a victim of that news on the other. Less. These theories tend to be appropriate under particular circumstances, and there's still some ambiguity here and there, but as we debate them, we'll develop some instincts about which theories are the most appropriate, give us the most critical thinking over against boxes 2 and number 1. And about the theoretical issues which apply. We go on to step number 4, choosing our loyalties. As we do our philosophical work, our thinking, our analysis on these, don't make a conclusion until you ask your question, who benefits? To whom are you finally loyal? Is it to yourself, to your professional colleague? Are you being loyal to your advertising firm and its policies, first of all? Is your loyalty to your viewers, to the public, to readers? Or to the victim in this case? And periodically, it won't be clear in our own thinking until step 4, the implications of what we've done so far and our thinking so far, and we finally make a decision in quadrant 4 of the Potter box. In fact, that was a situation in the introductory case that we used. It's figure 1-3 on page 7. When we're dealing with the Rick Thompson and Jan England. We're suggesting as we go through the Potter box that finally British television decided it wanted to be loyal to the families involved, didn't want them to suffer anymore. They've suffered so far because we're dealing with children. The U.S. newspaper was loyal to its general readership. Our readers deserve information that we have rather than our restraining it from them. Here, British television decides to go with flesh and blood people involved. And the U.S. newspaper, in this case, with a general readership. We have loyalty to those who buy our paper, to our subscribers, to our clients. And as we talk about box number 4, one of the things that we use there in making a decision, that our loyalties ought to be toward flesh and blood people who are right there under our influence, or who could be discredited by the paper, rather than making an appeal to something abstract, like my loyalty to the public. In any case, in box number 4, in step 4, we'll ask ourselves, finally, who will benefit? Who are you trying to serve? Are you really being loyal to yourself and your own career? Or to your firm? And sometimes it's important to be loyal to your firm if you said in your contract you would do X and Y. On other occasions, being loyal and showing solidarity with them. And finally saying, I'll support Mothers Against Drunk Driving time because that public interest group matters to me. And you make a choice because you've chosen in step number in the sociological arena to support certain people who may be suffering rather than have general conclusions of support to your organization or to your readers. What Potter attempts to do then is help us clarify our thinking at each step of the process, and I hope you won't find it too cumbersome and onerous as we work our way through it. But by the time you're finished, at least have the feeling, the sense that you've taken into account the important details, you followed a guided decision-making process, and have drawn a conclusion that you can debate in the light of day. It's a morally justified conclusion that takes seriously both principle and practice, sociology or sociological phenomena, and philosophy, with the purpose, in terms of our goal of this course, to enabling each of us to be mini ethicists ourselves, to do ethical work, to do moral reasoning on our own, and not merely debate ideas and end up confused as to how our conclusions in this case may transfer to conclusions in others. So I hope you find it valuable as you go along in a learning experience of worth and the distinction between values and principles or theory, and the importance of the loyalty quadrant, our insistence on getting the details straight, will help to invigorate your own thinking about the important task of professional ethics. Are there any quick comments or responses just in the last minute or so? Anything you want to come back to in terms of my presentation? As I was going along, I noticed some quizzical responses, and I should have stopped at that point in order to bring them to the floor. But anything based on your reading, or on the case that we had in the book, or my comments here that you want to address quickly as the time finishes. The distinctions between, go ahead, I'll take this as one question and then we'll finish.
When we were going through the steps, and when you get to the step when you finally make the judgment or you set a policy, the word policy kind of bothers me because it sounds like something finite that you're going to use in all situations. But is it better to think of the Potter box as like an ongoing, always going back to the first step and always questioning the policy?
Oh, I think in a sophisticated context, you're right, that we're constantly debating our decisions, that we go back again and again, that we found the right conclusion in this case, but don't want to use it to set a set of rules that we can follow as we go along. But I mentioned policy because we can adopt certain standards about dealing with anonymous sources. Or, as I mentioned, the Louisville Courier-Journal, when they ran into the problem of suicide and had some suicide that seemed to reflect the way the story was being run in their paper, they examined everything in that case and set a certain series of policies, 3 or 4 steps that we will go through before we run a story. People have done that with advertising. Milwaukee Journal has explicit policy about what advertising, it won't accept anything that's racist or sexist, for example. I mean, I share your same concern that if you just end up generating a series of rules, then you're back into a kind of Kantian ethics in which there's a certain number of rules or guidelines that we just put through, whereas what Potter is suggesting, there always is ongoing struggle. And every rule, as you invoke it, let's say in box number 3, step 3, has to bump up against the real life situation entailed there. The social context makes a difference. I do believe that setting policy is an important part of our endeavor, and believe we can do it in a way that is more dynamic than you're suggesting, rather than just generating a bunch of rules and then relaxing and having a kind of institution that we work with, which is pretty mindless because they just tick off the rules that people follow. It's a question of organizational culture that I'd love to get back to. There are ways of developing within your firm, within your organization, certain expectations, a commitment to those that are undercovered, the way that we deal with it, how we handle sensational coverage, or how many accidents to put in the air. I mean, there are certain decisions we can make that are important rules to follow, but not necessarily the blind cookie rules that you're suggesting. Well, I appreciate your patience today. I'll come back on Wednesday to just a few additional questions if you have it, but we'll get on to Aristotle and keep working on this model as we go along.